In today's podcast, we speak with the former federal Labor MP for Melbourne Ports, Michael Danby, who held that seat from 1998 to 2019. During his time in Parliament, he held significant positions, including Parliamentary Secretary for Foreign Affairs, where he helped shape the foreign policy discussion in the Rudd government. Michael Danby first joined the Labor movement when he was starstruck with Bob Hawke, who was at the time the leader of the ACTU. In this discussion, we have a far-ranging conversation that goes through issues with the modern-day Labor Party, issues with the Australian media, and how we can chart a path forward considering the pretty extreme economic and political climate we're in all over the world. So I really enjoyed this discussion. It was great to sit down with Michael. He was very generous with his time. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. Thanks. Well, hi, Michael. Thanks for jumping on the podcast. So just to give you context, the podcast is called Checks and Balances. And the idea behind the podcast was to combine both a business, so we've got business people that we invite on, and we've got political people that come on as well. And I wanted to sort of have a cross-reference between those two topics. But how are you going anyway? Sorry, I cut you off.
I'm fine, thanks. I've just come in from the Melbourne cold, so in my puffer jacket and cashmere scarf. So it's just keeping me warm in the study.
Nice, for sure. And I really appreciate you jumping on as well. As I was saying before, I first encountered your content. I used to watch Andrew Bolt quite a bit. And it was interesting to me because I, to be transparent, come from a liberal, like I've volunteered for the Liberal Party and come from that side of politics, but seeing, I think Andrew Bolt used to work for Bob Hawke, I think was his history.
No, I think he worked for a Northern Territory Labor senator. It wasn't quite as highfalutin as Bob Hawke. He was more friendly to that side of politics when he was a lot younger. He would, of course, say that he's grown up.
Oh, for sure, yes. And so anyway, the interesting thing was I noticed that there were a lot of people that came onto his show that were from the Labor side of politics. And if we look at today's context where Labor is kind of struggling with the issue of the Gaza conflict and Israel and Palestine, why did you, and this is kind of going deep into history a little bit, why did you kind of lean towards Labor as a youngster when you were kind of growing up?
Well, Labor was very different in those days from what it is now. It was more towards the political centre, and I was a young, enthusiastic university student and saw Mr. Whitlam and Mr. Hawke when they were the political leaders of the day, and got involved in supporting Labor when it was a very exciting era in the early 70s of Labor under Whitlam and in the unions under Hawke. I was actually closer to Hawke. It was a bit cheeky. When I was a 17-year-old, there was a Labor Party conference at the Chevron Hotel in St Kilda Road, Melbourne, and I bowled up there with a friend of mine, and ultimately at the end of the conference, where there was, by the way, a debate on the Middle East, we ended up in Bob Hawke's room, and to be 17 and to sort of be hanging around with the big boss was kind of fun.
So was he wouldn't have been Prime Minister at that point, was he? Or he was
No, he was the president of the ACTU.
Okay. Yep.
When the ACTU was far more important than it is these days. And it was like quoted every second day in the paper, and he'd be doing TV interviews and he wouldn't take any prisoners when he would appear on the equivalent of the 7:30 report, which was then called Nationwide. In fact, he had some blood-curdling interviews with Richard Carlton, who has since passed on.
I think I watched one of those interviews where he said, "Get that smirk off your face," or "You've got a smirk on," or was that somebody else? I think I remember seeing that.
It's where he said something about Carlton said to him, "You've got blood on your hands." And he turned to him and said, "You are ridiculous. You are disgusting."
Yeah, I think.
But yeah, the
Yeah.
ABC was not so uniform and boring as it is today, which is the
Yep.
reason it's losing audiences all over the country. So, for instance, you say you've seen me on Bolt, but
Yep.
really I should be sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, you've got to be an egotist or a narcissist for that, occasionally on the ABC debating lefties or debating right-wingers from the political centre. But of course, they never ask because there's only their views in a certain paradigm.
So have you noticed that has gotten worse over the past even 5 years, where the ABC is refusing to have different types of guests on its shows intentionally?
I think what it is yes, it's certainly become worse in the last 5 years. Not coincidentally, since Mark Scott was the managing director of now the vice chancellor at Sydney University, who's caved into the Hizb al-Tahrir allies. Since he was chair, so it's become more and more a staff collective, and no one exerts any influence there who are meant to be paid to do it, like editor in chief. And Henry, it's an even worse problem that they don't know that there are other people who don't share their worldview. So they don't even know the guests to ask to be part of a proper debate. Now,
Yeah.
if you gave me any one of the ABC programs, I could double their ratings straight away by restoring all of the people who now boycott the ABC, particular the older AB demographic. That's the, in media terms, the sort of wealthier, higher educated university people who just completely don't watch it anymore
Yeah.
because there's no debates. There's only one view. I'm not interested in listening to what 30-year-old woke people talk about the Republican cause, day or night, or gender affirmation or identity politics. It's boring as batshit.
Yeah.
And there should be debates about politics. There should be less debates about the government's schemes for various environmental or I'm not saying environmental is not important. Energy is very important, and the price of electricity. But
Yep.
you never hear a debate on the ABC about the left-wing nature of the government. It's a complete puzzle to most people. Why does Albo do all of these things? This is the first time in Australian history a Labor government has been dominated by the socialist left. Until even 10 years ago, you would never have had the position where a prime minister, a foreign minister were both from the left wing of the party. In the Hawke days, the left were not tolerated, is the wrong word, but they were given the social security portfolios, but they were kept out of the serious stuff. So that's a paradigm shift in Australia, but completely unexplained because Mark Scott and his flunkies at the ABC won't debate it. And what's worse about it is, I'm sorry to sort of deep dive into the ABC, but I know Laura Tingle. She's their chief political correspondent. I know her very well. She's very intelligent. She and Patricia Karvelas and David Spears all know this.
Yeah.
It's not as if it's a secret to them, but they will never discuss it because they want the paradigm to be within the issues of the left. So therefore, people who criticise it, particularly from the social democratic rump that's left in Australia these days, completely unacceptable, let alone conservatives or libertarians or many other people who should have their views. There should be a really strong energy debate on the ABC about electricity prices and how we get firming in the renewables mix that we've got, but you'll never see it. You'll never see it there.
So is that the main issue, is that the collective staff control what they want the content to be, and the people that are put in charge to manage things are just not listened to? Is that the kind of the power structure there?
No, I don't think the people who manage it even know that there are issues. They do know that there are issues in the sense now that there are falling ratings and complete lack of support from the right side of politics. But I don't think there's any sort of top-down or middle-down decision to have a debate about this topic or that topic in one particular way. It's just the zeitgeist. It's just the atmosphere. So that they don't work within paradigms where, oh, look, it's necessary to go out like Andrew Bolt does and get a couple of people who have different views on this, or, whatever. That's why that program, can't even remember what it was called, but it was about 6:30 before the news on the ABC died, because they'd choose 5 people who all agreed with each other, and it was boring, therefore.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So actually that's kind of a good, just to shift it a little bit. I used to watch Paul Keating in Parliament, and I'd listen to him go through the economic issues, and I'd think, wow, this guy really knows. Well, at least you could perceive that he knew what he was talking about. He could pull out figures. He would talk about particular issues about, the balance between, what's the word? Anyway, just particular issues. And now when you look at Parliament, there's not really, I'm not saying there's not good individuals in there, but what's the main difference between the Labor Party when Hawke and Keating kind of ran it versus the Labor Party now? You've already talked about the fact that the left wing basically in the top positions, but what do you think is kind of, if you look a little bit deeper, what's the issue there or the difference?
There are much less sort of individualistic MPs on both sides, but particularly on Labor. There's like, you have to be a staffer, you have to be selected by a union, etc. When I won pre-selection for Melbourne Ports, there was a North Korean style turnout of branch members. So we had 630 branch members, 600 voted in the pre-selection, 4 or against me. Simon Crean, the late Simon Crean, who was against me, was so motivated, and it would have been a scandal if it was now, but he got away with it because it was 25 years ago. Turned up in his Commonwealth car with his ancient father-in-law in his dressing gown and slippers, who he'd just taken out of a nursing home, so he could stand in the queue to vote against me. So people were individuals, people had to claw their way into political power, and they had to represent strong interests. So I think people are much more anodyne these days. There are a few people left, one of whom I think will be defeated at the next election, unfortunately, like Peter Khalil, the Coptic Egyptian member for the seat of Wills. But you have to toe the line much more. And I think the future of Australian Labor, or the kind of Labor I represented, died when Kimberley Kitching met her early death at age 52. That's why the Mean Girls, Penny Wong and Katie Gallagher, hated Kimberley so much, because she was so apparently, to anyone who knew her, the sort of a different pole, a different magnet. She spoke 5 languages, was a brilliant lawyer. In 6 years was sort of sought after in international affairs as a speaker and a brain, and they really didn't want her to be promoted further up. So they did everything they could to denigrate her and deny her that Senate pre-selection. So Kimberley would have been foreign minister. She would have been at least deputy leader of the Senate, because that always came from the right. But without someone there who's a brain box, without someone there who's an alternative thinker, a lot of people in the right of the Labor Party, you couldn't even name them, most of them. They're just hopeless. They're just, it's sort of empty vessels, and it's so sad for the future of Australia. So, Albanese is much more moderate than he used to be when he was a university radical when we were both at university, but that may surprise you, but he's not as bad as many of the others that are there, which is not a high bar, is it?
Yeah. Okay. So that was a factional thing between the Mean Girls and Kimberley Kitching.
It was, yeah. Again, did you ever hear that from Patricia Karvelas or Laura Tingle or whatever? No, you didn't. So
No, they didn't really mention it.
The key thing to the whole business, and that was to deny Kimberley progress, because it would have meant an ideological cleavage opened up, and people could gravitate to Kimberley. Now, she was in a minority, and things wouldn't have changed with the election system that Kevin Rudd set up for Labor Party leadership. It always meant that after Shorten, a left-winger will be elected. But Kimberley was very dangerous to them because of the alternative, we say in German, Weltanschauung, it's alternative worldview that she represented.
Yep.
You see, she was a Labor person like me who's in favour of cheap electricity, who believed pensioners and working class people shouldn't be charged massively because we only have renewables, where the country in the world that has decided to have an electricity grid only powered by them. I think Chris Bowen is mad.
Yep.
And I do it for the same reason that Jenny George, who was a left-winger who's become much more realistic in retirement, that the aim of parties like the Labor Party is not to fetishise green fantasies. It is to make electricity cheaper for industry and for people. The idea is you work for people, not for some green goal where Australia is 1% of global emissions and the Chinese are 32%, and they're building a coal-fired power plant every week or two.
So how would you compare then the policies of both the Liberals and Labor going into the next election with energy? Because Peter Dutton came out with his announcement with 7 new nuclear plants, and then they've got Labor on the other side saying that, no, we're going to do full out renewables. Nuclear is not viable. What's your view on that?
Well, I follow Jenny George very closely in the Australian. She is former environment spokesman. She's very close to all of these issues. She knows the energy market and its effect on the environment much better than I do. She says it's childish, infantile to have pictures of fish with 3 eyes in it or whatever.
Yeah.
What you should do is cost. How much will these 7 nuclear plants that Dutton is proposing contribute to the electricity grid? How much do we need them? What will the cost of establishing them over 10 years, which they cost to build, be against the cost of the vast array of windmills and transmission wires that we're building across rural and regional Australia? So I'm in favour of being rational, like Paul Keating. I know that's why Paul Keating appealed to you, because what he would do is he would judge one thing in one basket against another basket and say what was in the interests of the Australian people. So I think that's the way to look at it. I'm not in favour of nuclear or against nuclear. I'm in favour of Australia being productive and seeing whether with the one thing I do think that's important is that there are new nuclear mechanisms which are less dangerous than they were in the past, and therefore Australia should start thinking openly. I mean, if some countries can build them in 10 years and France has got 70% of its transmission in nuclear, I don't think Mr. Macron has got 3 eyes, has he? I mean,
No.
I think, what could be good for them could be good for us, especially since in South Australia we've got all that bloody uranium where we could be the powerhouse of the world.
Yeah, and that's what everybody says. It seems kind of silly that they would reduce it down to that little cartoon of the fish when it's a serious issue. And
Henry, we export it. We export it to the Indians, and it was one of the last debates I participated in when I was a delegate to National Conference with the right when we defeated the left over exporting uranium to the Indians. There was some passion because India had its own atomic weapons that it would use uranium we exported for other things than peaceful nuclear energy. It's just they can get what you do is in a rational world you place caveats on your exports. So you can't use this for nuclear weapons production, but you can use this for nuclear power plants. And of course, India's an open democracy and Australia's an open democracy, and therefore it's much easier to deal with countries like that. I wouldn't favour selling uranium to China, because I think if even the great Albo and Penny Wong, who are friends of China, if they got assurances from the Chinese leadership that they wouldn't use it for anything else, I would be a bit doubtful.
Yes, yes. And with the factions, so with the issue and the events that happened with Kimberley Kitching, do you think that factions in parties, in kind of under a natural circumstance, would tend to try and literally get rid of each other as much as they can? Or do you think there is a way where they can sort of come together? It's a big issue because it's come up many times with even, Turnbull and Abbott and all those types of events. But what do you think there's a solution to that, or like an approach that people can take so someone like Kimberley Kitching, that sort of event wouldn't transpire?
No. I think in both parties it's quite legitimate to have different factions, and in some extent they're good because they organise different patterns of ideas, and those patterns of ideas have a chance to sort of debate with each other before they come out, etc. I don't think it's a good idea for the New South Wales Liberals to have Matt Keane, or whatever his name was, establish without discussion in the New South Wales Liberal Party or in the New South Wales government goals on energy on renewables that were not approved by the party. So good to have factions. Factions should debate it at the conferences, or at least within the New South Wales Parliament. But it's not for leaders to impose these kind of things without discussion. So factions can be helpful like that. Yes, they do try and win power over each other, and that waxes and wanes. I mean, you've got that group in the New South Wales, in the Liberal Party all over Australia, that Christopher Pyne from South Australia used to run, called the Black Hand, which is the Liberal moderates. And they were very clandestine.
Sounds ominous.
I think they should debate things openly. But it only happens if Patricia Karvelas, Laura Tingle, John Lyons, and all of those people who don't do their job were doing their job. So they could explain why, Christopher Pyne and Malcolm Turnbull had a different view from, Matt Canavan or whatever. And they let them on their programs to debate each other, rather than portraying Canavan as a madman and person who's, beyond the pale to discuss energy, electricity, or renewable energy.
So Labor, to me, the most, with what I've looked at, Hawke and Keating were probably the most successful Labor governments in the history of the country, because of the things that they did and the reforms that they had. How does the Labor Party, or how could someone from the centre possibly vote for the Labor Party, particularly with the things like the Voice? I don't know what your stance on the Voice is, but it felt like when Anthony Albanese came into power, the main issues were cost of living, energy, a couple of other things, but that was the thing that he really, a lot of the energy and attention for his first year was in the Voice, and it ultimately failed. A lot of people didn't like it. I actually volunteered for the No campaign, and when I walked through the street, everyone went, yay, because they hadn't been told that there were was a population that actually wanted the No vote. So anyway, back to the question: how does one possibly vote for the Labor Party from the centre, and what should they do to attract those types of voters, as opposed to the, appealing to the Greens or Green voters?
Yeah, well, this is the big problem for Labor, is that unfortunately, because of our electoral system, it means that at the next election, I doubt whether Albanese can be defeated in a straight out Liberal Labor contest, because you have the Teals, who have 12 of the former Liberal seats, and the Greens, who are waiting in the wings in some of the inner city seats. So the most likely outcome of the next election is However people vote, it's for Labor to go into a minority in alliance with the Teals, and even worse, possibility of being in alliance with the Greens. So what we'll have is Labor going even more to the left, because they'll have to accommodate both the Teals and the Greens in order to stay in government. And power is the aphrodisiac of most politicians, and that will be a big problem for them. It's very hard to see with the electoral system that Kevin Rudd set up within Labor for the election of the leader. I can explain it to you in a second, that Labor will ever be led by a non-left winger, a centrist again. So Kevin, in order to make up for his humiliation of being dumped as leader, created a system where 50% of the vote for the leader comes from the grassroots party members and 50% from the parliamentarians. Now, Bill Shorten, with only 44% of the vote, managed to fluke it the first time by getting a group of parliamentarians who are in the left to vote for him that one time. So he was the leader of the right, or centrist, in the party after the Rudd so-called reforms. But you'll never have that again. That's why Albo or someone like him will be in office. And, that's why we have, soft on China policies, crazed adherence to renewable energy levels, to the mix only coming from renewables that we have. The other thing that's very disturbing in Australian politics is Beijing's influence. It is so profound, so active, and you see it all the time. And you see it in the recent reception for the Chinese Premier. I'm not saying we shouldn't have good relations with a commercial trading partner, but to go silent on Taiwan, go silent on human rights, go silent on our Australians who are imprisoned in China, to say nothing about the Tibetans or all of the righteous causes, or the million Uyghurs. I come from a Jewish background, and there's a big Uyghur community there in South Australia. I think it's terrible that there are a million Uyghurs incarcerated in Beijing's concentration camps because of their religion and background, and that the Chinese are systematically destroying Uyghur culture, the names of all of their cities, wrecking the old city of Kashgar to eliminate all the mosques. I mean, it's just something from history, but no one says anything about it. We're very concerned whether our lobster tariff exports are restored, or the beautiful wine from South Australia can be exported to the Chinese communists. I'm happy for them to drink as much South Australian wine as they like, but it shouldn't determine Australian foreign policy or defence policy.
I didn't realise it was that big a number. A million's a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, some people say it's more. The other million that will surprise you too is, did you know there are more than 1 million people of Australian Chinese background amongst the 25 million Australians?
Yeah, I can understand that. That sounds about right. Yeah. So I watched a clip of you. I think you basically you were eulogizing Gough Whitlam when he died, and you called the Greens the ghoulish Greens. It was in Parliament. You were making a statement.
Must have been a long time ago, because Gough passed quite away.
Actually, yeah, that was 2014, I think.
Oh, okay, yeah.
You called them the ghoulish Greens, and I thought that was quite funny, because I think that they shouldn't be. I think a part of why I wanted to do these types of podcasts is to shed light on actually what do some of these parties really believe. For instance, should the Greens, and this is a question, should the Greens really be called the Greens? Because some of the ideas that they have underneath where the Green Party we support you immediately think, well, why wouldn't you vote for the Greens? They support the environment, and who doesn't want the environment to thrive? But actually,
who's in favour of air pollution? No one's in favour of air pollution. So they sound convincing, don't they? Just by looking at the name.
So what are some of the things that the Greens believe that people should be aware of, particularly younger voters that think, I'm worried about climate change and therefore I will vote for the Greens?
Yeah. Well, all of the different parties have targets on renewable energy, and you have to judge whether they're viable or not. But the Australian Green political party is a very different beast from Green parties around the world. Now, isn't it significant that the Foreign Minister of Germany just was in Australia, who's a Green? The ruling alliance in Germany is a Green Social Democrat FDP coalition. Do you think she ever spoke to the Australian Greens, or the Greens invited her to speak to a party meeting? They wouldn't go within 100 miles of her, because the German Greens are serious people, serious on human rights, serious on defence, serious, supporters of Ukraine against Russia, serious on all kinds of issues that the Green Party in Australia purport to be interested in. The Green Party in Australia, for any young person, they should interview Bob Brown and ask him how far they've moved from his environmental paradigms that he established within that party from those days. They are not a Green Party. They are a far left party. Adam Bandt's MA thesis, which he tried to conceal for 15 years, was on Soviet jurisprudence. Jurisprudence. Now, why is that important? It's not important at all, except in the sense that it shows you what a fantasy world the leader of the Australian Greens lived in. There was no such thing as Soviet jurisprudence. It was, if you disagree with the Russian communists, off to the Gulag. That was Soviet jurisprudence. So it's here you have a person whose whole mentality is just so false. And if you look at the policies of the Greens, they're so extreme, particularly on foreign policy, anti-American, anti-defence. They say nothing about the atrocities of Hamas. They say nothing about the terrible repression in Iran, which is driving all of this war in the Middle East. You'd think that the young women who are dying and imprisoned because they're forced to wear the hijab by the Iranian regime would be something that young left-wing Green Party-oriented people would do something about. But you'll never hear a word from the Australian Green Party. They are basically student politics of the 1970s and 80s writ into modern-day Australian politics. Pathetic, extreme left-wing, just absolutely, you can predict where they will be on every issue. They have no, and the interesting thing is you can't point to any figures amongst the Australian Greens who have any major differences with each other. Where are the Bob Brown people compared to the Adam Bandt people these days? I wish the Greens were more interested in koalas and Australian wildlife and fauna and flora than as they were in the past, but they've gone very far from it. But again, I shouldn't have to develop this with Henry on a podcast. This should be something that is being systematically written about or talked about by the people who are paid millions of dollars by us to expose all of this. Do you know, for instance, Henry, and your people listening to your podcast, that the Green political party has voted against every piece of national security legislation since 9/11.
Wow.
So there's all the laws, saying about ISIS brides or different groups being classified as terrorist organisations, or about the importation of arms through an Australian airport. Whenever a piece of legislation is put up on that, the Greens have voted against it. One of my biggest successes in the last term of Parliament was putting out a Green pamphlet explaining, picturing each of the Green Party people with the law and what they were voting against. And, again, it shouldn't be up to me. People like you should be able to know this, should be exposed by, all of these things are on the public record, but they're never talked about.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Very, very, very true. So to kind of shift gears, I know that in the past week and a bit, Jerry Seinfeld's gone around doing his comedy tour in different cities in Australia. And I'm not sure whether it's been every single event that he's done, but a lot of the events that he's done, there's been every time he's been heckled for the Gaza conflict and Israel. Why is it that Jewish people particularly always get singled out like this with these sorts of events? There's other conflicts that are going on, but it always seems to be Jewish people that get targeted. And what's he got to do with apart from race, what's he got to do with the war? He's just on there on a comedy tour. Why does that always happen?
Seinfeld handled it very well. Yeah. I think he had a concert in Adelaide too, didn't he?
He did.
He did, yeah. Not all of his concerts were disrupted by these people. It was just the main evening ones in Melbourne and Sydney. And what he said to them is, guys, you come to the wrong venue. If you want to convince people, you should go and do it somewhere else, because you're alienating all of the people. You can see that they're all laughing with me against you. This is not a success for you. He was schooling them while they were trying to disrupt his. And at one concert, he said in particular something that was very cutting. He said, look, you better go back to your organisers and tell them you've made another mistake, and that is you've paid all this money to a Jew for tickets to this concert. So, again, a big mistake. Why do people get... Look, Jerry Seinfeld can look after himself. He's a big boy. But there is a serious point in your question, and that is, why is it since October the 7th there seems to have been a paradigm shift in this issue coming up again? All Jews are blamed by the far left, by the Green Party and these kinds of people for Israel, for anything that Israel does. And it's all conflated together by these people who are prejudiced. And unfortunately, it seems that because of woke education in schools and universities, that younger people don't have much of a historical or geographic education, which in the past would have inoculated them against this kind of prejudice, because they would have learnt, people in my generation or slightly younger, World War II, for instance, and the atrocities there are a sort of break against, people being prejudiced on issues together involving Jews. So, for instance, in Germany, the German Greens and all of the political parties have that as part of their raison d'etre, that they are against that kind of prejudice because they know where it leads. So this is something that sort of Jews are very conscious of, that say, look, let's shift to all the American universities. All of the hardline protests and encampments and that kind of stuff that you see there, Americans reacted against them. It's not that it's like, they're in the wider world, taking the microcosm of a Jerry Seinfeld concert to a wider extent. people were alienated by universities being blocked off, by students being blocked from attending their lectures, by the vandalism and the hatred that was sort of being pushed out there. And I think, we get to the ridiculous extent, Henry, where the University of Sydney, an august academic institution, probably Australia's most august, has a vice-chancellor who, because he wants to mollify these extremist encampments and get them off his university, the most hardline group remaining were the Muslim students. And in order to get them off his back, he allows them to sit on a committee which is ruling through all of the investments that Sydney University do in defence, science, and in those kinds of very sensitive areas. So you have the ridiculous situation. Some of the people in that group are associated with Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a jihadist organisation, which is not classified in Australia yet as a terrorist organisation, unlike Hamas or Hezbollah, but is in the UK. So you've got members of Hizb ut-Tahrir sitting on a committee of the University of Sydney ruling in or out defence or security contracts. So you see what I mean? It starts with the Jews. It starts with some Jewish student being barred from attending a lecture, etc., by these fanatics. But if you give in to them, their poison spreads throughout society. It's spread thanks to the gormless, witless University of Vice-Chancellor at Sydney University into the very lifeblood of Sydney University. Now, if you were a serious AI contractor or high technology person, would you allow a Hizb ut-Tahrir person to look at your contracts with Sydney University? You probably wouldn't have them there.
Good point. So one thing that I guess, worries me or makes me feel caution is that a lot of people that I speak to, just friends really, they, after the war began, they're leaning on the side of the Palestinians. And every time I've had this discussion, I've not really said too much because I feel like that there are a lot of facts that are very hard to decipher through what's actually going on. But then I think about the basic point is that if you poke the bear, or if you're the one that initiates the conflict and then there's a return of conflict, that's fair game. That's a very, to make it very simple. But what are some facts around the conflict that people should know that are not necessarily being told these facts?
First of all, let's go to Donald Trump's debate with Biden last night. The most valuable thing that he said, in my view, Trump, was that all of these conflicts in the Middle East, Hamas in Gaza attacking Israel, Hezbollah in the north, the Houthis blocking off 90% of international shipping through the Suez Canal from Yemen, none of them would be taking place if Iran wasn't financing them. Now, in his valid criticism of Biden was that since Biden came to office, oil sanctions on Iran were not enforced. So the Chinese are very smart people. If they can get oil at $60 a barrel rather than $100 a barrel, they'll buy it at 60. And if the Iranians sell it to them for the last 3.5 years because Joe Biden doesn't do anything about it, they will buy it. So $100 billion of finances have gone to Iran thanks to the Biden non-enforcement of oil sanctions. And what that has meant is that this whole thing you see in the Middle East is an Iranian-financed circle around Israel. To see Hamas or Hezbollah or any of these conflicts in isolation is falling into the paradigm of the very anti-Israel editor of the ABC, John Lyons. He wants you only to see the poor civilian casualties in Gaza and not the big picture. There's no analysis, no understanding, no debate. Let's have a debate between people who are Biden supporters and Trump supporters over the correct policy with Iran and what will that do. I see it on Deutsche Welle, on the French television stations, on all of the publications across the world, but you don't see it in Australia. So people don't know. They have it out of context. Second thing to know is that you're right. When any country is gratuitously attacked like that across their borders, it was such a failure of the Israelis to let Hamas come across and do that. And there should be a terrible reckoning in Israel of the political leadership when the war is over. That countries are going to react. Now, for instance, far away Australia, along with the United States, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, did we accept any of the media paradigms about ISIS or Daesh a few years ago when they said, "Oh, well, you can don't attack them because you can't destroy them. They're an ideology." No, we went and killed Baghdadi. We went into Iraq and eliminated the Islamic State because it was a danger to all of us. People, Westerners from all of those countries were being captured and executed online. You remember that when they put these poor people, journalists or aid workers, in these orange outfits and then cut their throats online. Couldn't be tolerated. We had to stop it. And similarly, you can't expect any nation state, especially a tiny one. I mean, again, the context is people have no idea the size of Israel compared to the surrounding Islamic world. No idea. It's a tiny little strip, about the third of the size of Tasmania, and a bunch of jihadists came across the border, raped, tortured, butchered 1,200 people, and the Israelis simply can't live next to people like that anymore. So the solution is not as Sky UK or the BBC or our ABC here or Al Jazeera say that the Israelis are butchering 30,000 people. That's not the solution. The solution is to go and attack the terrorists, root them out. And the Israelis are about finished in Rafah now. So I think that will conclude the Gaza operation from the point of view of a war. So it'll be something less than that from now on. It'll probably be what you call a counterinsurgency. But
and just quickly,
sure.
It does feel like that the argument's being lost, though, from the Israeli perspective. People look at that and go, they're constant. The thought is they're constantly bombing civilians. But then I think, well, the context is, if you look at World War II, there were instances that happened as well. When you're at war, there are certain things that happen. But how do you think, or why do you think, from the Israeli standpoint, the argument is being lost to people that would usually be pretty well center?
Because I don't think there are any conflicts that you can fight these days which are being filmed on television where people will support the killing of any civilians, even if it's in the pursuit of a military purpose. If we filmed World War II now and the bombing of Dresden and Hamburg, the Allies killed 100,000 people in the firebombing of Hamburg sometime in 1943. There was no protest movement in Britain to say, oh, the Germans, we need to sort of send them civilian aid or bring them food or water. I think that should be done in Gaza. I think that the Israelis should adopt, and they do, high humanitarian standards. But you've got to defeat the dangerous Nazi-like organisation, Hamas. that initiated this conflict. And again, young people won't know this, but if you watch all the Middle East channels, you'll see the Hamas people go on and say, yes, we did it, and we're going to do it again and again and again until we eliminate Israel. So, you know, it's very nice to sit in Adelaide or Melbourne or Sydney and say, oh, these Israelis are being too hardline, you know, fighting Hamas like we did against Daesh. Oh, no, we can't do that. But what do you do with people who live in such a tight connection to you, who promise to do it again and again and again? They need to be defeated militarily, Hamas. The Israelis need to keep distinguishing between civilian and military as much as they can. The casualties are much less, and you'll find this when the war is concluded. The United Nations has already reduced the 36,000 casualties to 21, which I would argue half of them are military people. It's very funny, by the way, when you see the TV coverage. Do you ever see bodies of Hamas soldiers being killed? They seem to be all women and children. The Israelis are terrible at war if they're only killing women and children. The main thrust of what they're doing is trying to kill the terrorists, because what they want to do is to prevent what happened on October 7 happening again, especially when the people who run that outfit, Hamas, promise to do it again and again and again. One good development, by the way, the Qataris have apparently just kicked out the international leadership of Hamas from the six-star hotel in Doha that they were hanging round, and they've been forced to move to Turkey. So that's good. I don't expect it's a bit of a news flash for you that the international leadership of Hamas will be long living after this war is over, because the Jews are very stiff-necked people, and if you kill 1,200 of them and you boast about it on international television, you might end up like Eichmann.
Interesting. You mentioned.
Have you watched the TV series Fauda?
Fauda?
Yeah.
No, I haven't. Is that where that comes from?
It's a great series on Netflix that I recommend to a lot of your viewers. That goes into this complexity of living in a Western state next to a third world country that has got lots of jihadists living amongst it, and how you have to understand the mentality of those people. It's about a unit in the Israeli police that got those three hostages out recently. Do you remember the three hostages? Oh, and the girl. They got the four of them out. Yep. There's this TV series about their activities in the West Bank and Lebanon over the last few years. Very popular, top-rating show on Netflix.
Fauda, F-O-W-D-E-R?
No, F-A-U-D-A.
F-A-U-D-A. Okay, I'll check it out. Now, time is kind of running out, but I wanted you addressed the debate yesterday. I was shocked at how bad Biden performed. I thought he would at least be able to stay pretty well coherent, even though badly coherent. But he really, I was shocked. What was your reaction to the debate?
Well, I was a lot more prepared for it because I've been watching Biden a lot more closely, and it was clear to me that the issues of senility and dementia are very, very much to the fore before he came in. I think Trump agreed to do this because he knew that if he could get him out in front without a teleprompter, simply by being reasonable and coherent himself, and let Biden disintegrate in front of the television cameras. But it's a shock for people who are not as aware of Biden's dementia as people who very closely observe American politics. And let me tell you, I think there's valid criticism in this, the same as I was making of the ABC here. Why is it that these issues were not exposed earlier? People knew that Biden was in such a bad way, and it's very bad for the Democratic Party that these issues weren't discussed because they had no real primaries. It means the American people have no real Democratic opposition, even though he's the president, to Trump. You'll see the opinion polls swing massively in favour of Trump now, and he'll be elected in a landslide. And it's because the media and the Democratic Party didn't expose their own weakness and discuss these things in an open and transparent way as they should have been, because that is the way to prevent these kind of things happening before they're too late. It's I hope it's not too late now, and that there will be a viable alternative, that the grandees of the Democratic Party, Clinton and Obama, will go to Joe Biden, and particularly his wife, who seems to have an incredible influence on all of this, to her and say, look, please, you had a term as president. It's a great honour to have been president of the United States. Go out gracefully. We don't want to see you die in office or lose the election to Trump. Declare that, like Lyndon Johnson did in 1968, I will not be a candidate for the next election. Open the delegates at the Chicago Democratic Convention to vote for whoever they like, and let Kamala Harris and let Gavin Newsom and let whoever have days of appealing to these people to get a viable alternative. But it's all dependent upon Joe saying he's not going to run, Jill releasing him, and him releasing the delegates. I think my wife's been very observant about this. She said over the last 6 months that there are going to be books written after this presidency about Jill Biden's failure to look after her husband. It's really unjust what's being done to him. I know why you were shocked, Henry, because it was terrible to see, wasn't it? Didn't you feel embarrassed half the time?
I felt very sorry for him, because he stopped for about 3 seconds, and I thought, this is the president.
Let's hope that the Chinese and the Russians don't do anything before he goes out, because they see this as an opportunity, because they don't think there's anyone there who can make a decision.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, I want to relate something we talked about earlier to this. Democratic conventions in Chicago are always a problem, but this one's going to be worse than ever, because they're going to have to make some real decisions there. And all the delegates are going to be in the hall, and Gavin Newsom and Kamala Harris are going to be pulling their hair and pulling their shirts to vote for them. And you're going to have all of these crazed far-left people outside demonstrating for Hamas. So they've promised to do it in a really big way to sort of draw attention to their cause. Really? Do you think that's what the American people are going to be concerned about? Do you think that's, again, you see, what happens is you don't pay attention to this because a bunch of Jews were attacked in Los Angeles or New York, but then it comes to the national debate being influenced by these crazy people and distorting completely the public discourse. But America needs to make serious decisions about who's going to be the Democratic contender for President of the United States. It's going to be decided in Chicago. I'm pretty sure Biden is going to have to acquiesce to Obama and Clinton when they come to tap him on the shoulder. And you'll have riots at that conference with all of these ratbags outside attacking mainstream America who've got to make these hard decisions.
Do you think this was predetermined by the Democrats to intentionally let him fall in front of, so publicly in front of everybody, so that they could put their preferred candidate in? Or do you think it was just coincidence?
Well, there's something odd about the fact that the first debate was so early.
I think that was odd.
It could be his Irish stubbornness that sort of made him rise to the challenge of Trump's, I'll speak against you anywhere, anytime. So that could have been partially influencing the decision. But it's odd that it's before the convention. If I was Biden in another world and he was more coherent, or Jill Biden and I understood more about politics, I would have put the debate after the convention. So you lock him in first and then have your debates. But that wasn't done. So they have the possibility of that. There's a fantastic op-ed in the Financial Times by its editor Gideon Rachman, who says thank heavens that it's that sequence of events, because they still have the opportunity to pull him off stage.
That's what I thought. It did seem odd. Now, how much time do you have?
I've
A
got
bit of time?
another
What do you...
5 or 10 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to ask this question because I feel as though that the Green Party is on the rise, and even here we had a local election here maybe 3-4 months ago, and the current member who retired was Stephen Marshall, who was the former premier, and it got taken over by Labor, but there was a huge Green vote. I think the vote for the Greens here was about 14 or 16% in the local election. What are some lessons that, that maybe the Liberal Party or the Labor Party can take or should adopt to try and stop the Greens in the next election, like the federal election coming up? How can we sort of shift the tide from crazy policies, like you mentioned, they voted against every national defense policy since 9/11. What can we take, even drawing from the lessons of the Hawke Keating era, where everyone seemed to be more sensible and they had their head wrapped around the numbers and things like that? How can we approach that? So I know it's a big question, but I'm keen to hear your response.
It is a very big question, and I don't have sort of trite answers for you. But I can tell you, you have to develop the arguments. You have to sort of systematically look at all of the Green policies, outline them. Do, for instance, the Green Party support a death tax? All of the young people who were in that 14% you talked about are going to inherit their parents' properties in North Adelaide or some other lovely place in South Australia when they pass on. Do they want the Green political party to come into their house and seize 40% of their parents' money and jewellery and carpets and artworks? What's their attitude on the death tax? Because the Greens are very much against people accumulating capital and inheriting those kind of things. You need to find these things out. What is the update on what I said on national security legislation? Why doesn't every political party produce what the Greens do? Why don't the journalists do that? What is the cost of their policies? That should be the greatest thing against the Greens. I mean, you can say you're in favour of no one paying rent. What does it cost? And who pays for that in their taxes? What do baristas have to pay as an increase in tax in order to have everyone paying no rent? Is the death tax going to be at 30% or 40%? Do they support terrorists being admitted to Australia? We shouldn't care less about that. We don't vote in favour of any national security legislation, and they're going to live next to people in some of those beautiful suburbs in Adelaide. You've got to give people concrete things where they see what the Green political party stands for.
And what do you think about the sort of doctors' wives cohort that they're wealthy? They only really care, they care about green issues. Like, they voted out Josh Frydenberg, which I thought was insane when there was someone who was so capable. They voted him out for, I'm not sure who the person was, but a Teal candidate.
Monique Ryan is her name. She's a really hard line, and I would say, and it's not libelous to say it, personally unpleasant local representative who's going to make no impact anywhere, whereas the Treasurer of Australia, whatever you think of the Liberal Party or Labor Party, is thrown out, and the alternative leader to Dutton. I mean, anyhow, it's a very strange choice as far as big Australian interests are concerned, but that's very much wealthy doctors' wives who did that, and they do the same for Zoe Daniel, and they did the same for that person who threw Zali Stegel, who threw out Abbott. But the politics of those people are going to determine the fate of Australia, because in one go, you can't have the normal changes of government. See, normally in the past, when you had Liberal or Labor, it was very good for democracy. If the Labor Party was profligate, people could vote Liberal and throw them out of office. If the Liberal Party was involved in scandals, you could vote Labor and throw the Liberals out of office.
Yeah.
But it's much more difficult now, because the 12 seats, I think 2 or 3 of them might be lost back to the Liberal Party, but they're all Liberal Party seats. They mathematically can't win, even if they win more seats in Queensland and regional New South Wales. They can't win, in my view. I think they'll win some in West Australia too. They can't win back, and there can't be that change of government or that change in policy. So what you do is you get an election where Labor plus Greens and, God forbid, plus Labor plus Teals, and then, God forbid, the Greens will be a majority. And I know Jim Chalmers and Chris Bowen will say, "Oh, we'll never go into alliance with the Greens," but I know politics too, and that is the prospect of having power or not. It would be so tempting that, you know, you might be willing to make Adam Bandt Minister for the Environment in a Liberal, sorry, in a Labor Teals Green government.
I'm just shocked that they voted Josh Frydenberg out. I can't understand the thinking. He was so and now he works for Goldman Sachs or something. This is a capable person. They voted him out for an independent. It made no sense to me.
He's done a very good series on anti-Semitism for Sky News, which I recommend to all of the people who are watching this that they should look up. It's you can get it on YouTube. It's really well done. It includes all sort of major figures in Australian politics, from Julia Gillard to Peter Cosgrove, the former Governor General, to Dennis Richardson, the former spy chief. All of the mainstream people are commenting on how bad this thing is for society. The only person who doesn't seem to know about it much is Mark Scott, the Vice-Chancellor of Sydney University.
Yeah. Well, that's probably a good point to end on. I really appreciate your time, Michael, jumping on, and that was a pretty good conversation, I felt.
Thanks. I hope that